Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Marc Pierini, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe and a former EU ambassador in Turkey and Syria. For this week's show on the Middle East Brief, we're actually going to break this down into two segments. We'll be talking to Ambassador Pierini, my friend Marc, for the first 20 minutes or so, and we will follow up with a second episode with Rachel Elahus, who's at CSIS for a continued conversation about what just took place in London, which was NATO's 70th anniversary and the NATO summit in London. So, Marc, it's good to have you on the show. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to ground this discussion in obviously more of a Middle East focus, obviously because the name of the podcast is the Middle East Brief, and get a sense of, in the lead up to the NATO summit, Turkey was obviously on the agenda because of a lot of, I'd say, Western concerns about the Turkish government in terms of its democratization and policies in Syria and domestically, and also its relationship with Russia. So I was wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit, more or less where you sit in Brussels, what's the feeling on Turkey within NATO and how this all played out at the summit?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we should try to shed all the acrimony that we've seen on television, strong formulas, brain dead, and so on, and look at, the fundamentals. Fundamentals seen from Brussels is that you have a country, Turkey, which is basically turned to autocracy in the past few years, in a very systematic way with a constitutional reform, and therefore gone away from anything that resembles EU or Western standards. Now, in NATO terms, before the summit, what we had in front of us is basically Turkey, the first NATO country to buy and host advanced Russian missile systems with Russian personnel. So, leaving aside the actual deployment or not of these missiles, this is already a major political coup for Russia, and therefore Turkey comes to London with a sort of dented credentials as a NATO partner, whereas it still claims to be a solid NATO partner. And of course, on top of all this, the Syria incursion has dented these credentials further. All the more so, seen from Brussels again, that we have return of jihadists, which has been decided without any consultations, and of course the threat about refugees. We all know that most of this is for domestic consumption, but what remains is that you have a country, Turkey, looking very differently from only a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I was hoping if we could, basically break those things down into two. So in the lead up to the summit, we had Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who both himself and through Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, who said that they would block NATO's graduated response plan, basically the plan to defend the Baltic States plus Poland, unless there was movement within the alliance for a similar plan for the southern flank, which includes Turkey, to list the YPG as a terrorist group. The YPG obviously being the partner force that American and European militaries are fighting with in Syria against Islamic State. French President Emanuel Macron was sort of forward-leaning on this issue in a press conference with President Donald Trump. I was curious if you could get into that a little bit. As seen from Brussels, maybe like if Turkey is isolated in its push for the YPG to be listed as a terrorist group in NATO, and how it was seen that Ankara was, at least before the end of the summit, it ultimately lifted its block, how its blocking of the graduated response plan, or at least solidarity, was viewed amongst the broader acrimony that you just described?
Well, I think you have a mix of two policies. Basically, the French and European perception, leaving style issues aside, the German or the British perception of the role of Turkey in Syria is no different, or the role of Turkey in NATO. There's not much of a difference there. But basically, what you're saying is what I call the autocratic axis, Moscow, Ankara, Damascus, taking place, being installed, and that's not very much compatible with either the EU or NATO. And this is all happening with President Donald Trump's blessing. So that is what is extremely disturbing for Europeans. You have to remember one fundamental thing here, that we're seeing from Brussels in 72 years, if you go back to the Berlin Average or the Marshall Plan, or the following year, the creation of NATO, we're seeing the first US president deliberately and permanently hostile to European policy. Anyway, what concerns French president most, and again, same for the UK and same for Germany, is this weaponization of jihadists and weaponization of refugees. This has been a constant narrative from Ankara in the past few months. And just before the meeting, we see, actually, just before the visit to Washington, we've seen the first jihadist return. Of course, there are technical means to take this into account. The problem is the way this is happening. It's happening in a very hostile way from Ankara, and the narrative is extremely aggressive, in particular to France. And we should not forget, it's accompanied by other things like drilling for gas around Cyprus, and as we know, neither the economic zone nor the territorial waters are agreed upon. And then, of course, just before the London summit, the information that there is now a new agreement on maritime boundaries between Turkey and Libya, which is another provocation, at least it was seen as a major provocation. So this is a sort of accumulation of provocations that do not go down very well. And we also have to remember that so far, at least until the NATO summit, the NATO leaders meeting, most European countries would happily leave the controversy on the S400 missiles to the United States, although, of course, it concerns them because it sort of hampers the defense of Europe. But they would leave it to the US administration. Now it's not the case. It has become, probably thanks to Macron in part, a much more European problem. This being said, there was a lot of criticism of the French president before the summit because of the style, because of the brain dead narrative. But if we look deeper, we look at the French verbatim of the interview, which is the equivalent of 40 pages. If we look at almost similar reasoning that you find in Berlin or London about substantive issues that you find in NATO at this point, well, style aside, there is a high degree of convergence. And there is also, again, style aside, a good deal of convergence with Turkey, about Turkey. And so now, of course, we came out of the London meeting with a procedural solution, and that was expected, of course, but we remain with a fundamental ambiguity, which is one, NATO is a defensive alliance, two, Turkey is the first NATO country to hold missile systems from the country which is openly declared in the London statement an enemy. So we're stuck in the same place as before the meeting.
Yeah, it struck me is when Macron was speaking, I believe it was in a press conference with Donald Trump, he said that, he basically reaffirmed that the S400 is a defining issue. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and I'm sort of analyzing as I speak here. And what he was saying is he was going to seek clarity from Turkey about the intent of this system and basically how this system, the S400 in a NATO member, could be compatible with NATO solidarity or the concept of burden sharing by purchasing, in the political sense, interoperable systems. The Macron did eventually meet with Erdogan, I believe, as part of the quartet with Germany, France, Turkey, and the UK, where they were supposed to talk about Syria. It was a short meeting, it was only about an hour, which suggests to me that not much got done, but where they talked about Syria. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about, the European perceptions about Turkish policy in Syria, because that came up as well, and how that relates to the YPG issue in particular. Turkey ultimately did drop its insistence on naming YPG in a NATO document, in the graduated response plan. I found that to be telling, but a lot of wasted political capital in Ankara by at least threatening to block consensus for as long as it did, because some of the more sympathetic members to Turkey within the alliance, I'm thinking more about Poland, were the countries whose defense plans were being held up by an issue that I think most Europeans agree on, which is that the YPG may be politically problematic for them, but it's the vanguard force against ISIS which matters more. Curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, true. The four-country meeting was very short. If you take into account translation, it was extremely short. And essentially, it ended up in perhaps different words from the three Europeans, but everybody telling the Turkish president, what you're doing in Syria is something we have condemned from day one. It's not good. And on top of that, if you're counting on the European Union to fund your grandiose repatriation plan, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for several reasons. One, you wanted 440 kilometers long safe zone. You've been allowed by Russia to take 120 or 130, and that's it. As we know, Russian and Damascus forces have blocked Turkey on both sides, east and west. Secondly, this is all legally impossible in humanitarian law terms, and in the absence of a UN agreed peace settlement in Syria, it cannot happen. On top of which, of course, Syrians currently living in Turkey are not willing to go because they have zero security guarantees, zero enforcement mechanism to guarantee their security. So it's not going to work. And remember that in Turkey, between the UN speech at the end of September and the London summit, people have been preparing, as I said, grandiose plans for the return, cities and villages and stadiums and hospitals and mosques and this and that. The impression was that this was about to cost $26 billion or something. Europe is never going to do that. I mean, this is essentially a domestic political issue in Turkey. There is substantial help, the 6 billion euro plan that Europe promised has been implemented, is now coming to the very end of the identification stage. So not the spending stage, of course, but it has worked extremely well. And if you ask all the implementing agencies in Turkey, AFAD, Red Crescent, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, this is all working well. So basically, we know that the president of Turkey attributes his massive loss in the municipal elections to Syrian refugees, which of course is not an analysis shared by Europeans. The elections were lost for other reasons: economic policy, inflation, corruption, absence of rule of law. So essentially, this narrative was locked in very few words, but I guess extremely sharp words by the three Europeans. So we're not going anywhere. The strange thing is that, meanwhile, the Turkish administration, up to the level of deputy foreign minister, still says, we want strong relations with Europe, we want the accession process to be revived, which is exactly the opposite of the policies implemented by their president. So we're really stuck in an impasse here. And in the coming weeks and months, the new European leadership, the Commission, the High Representative, the European Council President, will have to think what is possible.
And as we kind of pivot, I have to ask about my own president, about Donald Trump. I think before these big summits, particularly after, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 years ago, when there was at least very brief speculation that he may announce a U.S. withdrawal from NATO. In the morning, I do remember that morning quite vividly because I got up and my Twitter feed was melting down.
Yeah. It was May 2017.
That's it. Yes, I was I remember that morning very vividly. Is for his standards, was this a success? And a success in that he did not cause considerable amounts of problems, in that the statement was signed off on quickly. He left without giving a large press conference where he called into question Article 5. He praised much of NATO for increase in defense spending, one of his issues, and more or less no major hiccups. I mean, is that reassuring to people in Brussels, or is that just sort of sigh of relief on to the next summit in about a year, and hoping for a leadership change in the U.S. in the upcoming election?
Well, what is reassuring is the fact that obviously President Trump was satisfied with the increase in spending from other members than the U.S. This is true. It has happened. So that is, a plus for the Trump administration. The other reassuring element, from what I understand, is that in the closed session of the leaders' meeting, Trump stuck to his briefing notes. No improvisation at all there. It's only in the press conferences or press appearances, if you want, with Macron, with others, that the narrative got a little bit inflamed, and especially because the usual jokes that used with Macron. Do you want some of these jihadists? That didn't go down at all with Macron. And remember the rebuttal. Macron said, "Let's be serious." So I think there was an effort, a concerted effort on the part of the Europeans to deal with the U.S. president's concerns about funding of NATO, but at the same time to say, look, what is happening in Syria is not good, and what you, the U.S. president, the U.S. administration, are letting Erdogan do with Russia is not proper. So I think the rebuttal, if you want, was both against Trump and Erdogan.
Yeah, and I mean, this leads me to the final question here before we wrap up, is just, obviously Russia plays a large role in this, with its invasion of Crimea, and then the Donbass, and obviously electoral interferences in both European and American elections. It was named in the NATO document that came out after the summit, which I believe is a change. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, from previous, relatively recent past, I should say. But it also hangs over the Turkey question, where we started this, with the S400 purchase, and Ankara's NATO bona fides, which is, on paper, they are a contributor to the alliance in every single mission of which they are deployed. Obviously are close, or at least meeting the 2% threshold that Donald Trump ascribes a lot of political value to, but they are also the purchaser of the S400. How would you say that moving forward, sort of the Russia question, both as it applies to Turkey, but maybe also as it applies to Europe, will play out as NATO, continues its, I would say, relatively successful efforts to prepare again to deter further Russian aggression?
Well, what's remarkable in the London Declaration is that you have this sentence: Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security, which you would have assumed Turkey would have blocked, but they didn't, or they were not in a position to block. What remains an oddity, if you want, after the London meeting, is that Turkey still wants to be a crucial member of NATO, but at the same time is using NATO only when it suits Erdogan's policies. So the fundamental contradiction that NATO is fundamentally a defensive alliance, whereas Turkey says we can have a foot on both sides, that hasn't been resolved. Clarifications are still needed. We don't have any more clarity today than before the London meeting. Of course, on the Russian side, disrupting the cohesiveness and the operations of NATO via agreements with Turkey is strategically useful. And this is irrespective of whether the S400 are deployed, connected, or what. The damage politically has already been done. If they are deployed, and of course deployed without connections with NATO system, that is another step, because the acquisition radar will work and will be damaging NATO systems. So there are lots of questions that have not been clarified. They need clarification for the European members of NATO. They need clarification for the US, because we have quite a few US assets on Turkish territory, as we all know. So the Turkish president can probably, given his control of the national media, say that, I made my point on terrorism and all forms of terrorism. Terrorism in all its forms and manifestations remains a persistent threat to us all. That's a sentence in the London statement. That's more or less satisfactory to President Erdogan, but it's only maybe 1/10 of what he wanted. So I think we still have a lot of work to do here. From a European perspective, apart from the fierce narrative that the Turkish president uses against the EU, what we see is that Turkey still has no alternative whatsoever to trade, investment, and technology relations with the EU. Russia doesn't solve this. China doesn't solve it in any significant way at the moment, certainly not Qatar. So what do we do?
It's a question that I think about a lot as somebody who makes a living. And the answer is I don't know yet, but I'm still working on it. If you figure it out, maybe you could tell me too.
Sure.
This has been great. I mean, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. And for listeners, we're going to have a follow-on second episode where we discuss this more from the U.S. side. So, Marc, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.